Some objects don't just look old, they feel alive. It's hard to explain, but when you're near them, every instinct in your body screams that something isn't right. For me, that feeling started with an old dollhouse. It was a Saturday morning in late autumn when I stumbled across a small estate sale in rural Pennsylvania. Most of the items were the usual junk: rusted tools, cracked porcelain, yellowed newspapers stacked in messy piles. But tucked in the corner of the garage was something that immediately drew my attention: a dollhouse, about 3 feet tall, sitting on a folding table like it was waiting for someone. Unlike the rest of the clutter, it wasn't broken, it wasn't dirty, it looked preserved. Its wallpaper was faded, but still clinging tightly to the walls. The curtains in the windows were carefully drawn, the furniture inside perfectly placed. It was so immaculate that it almost looked cared for. I bought it without thinking. It felt like a unique piece of history, something I could clean up and display. But the moment I carried it into my apartment, the air shifted. The living room seemed heavier, like something had come into the space with it. That first night, I caught myself glancing at it every few minutes, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was staring back at me through those tiny windows. Over the next week, I started noticing things about the dollhouse that unsettled me. At first, it was small. I'd walk past it and swear the miniature furniture was slightly out of place. The porcelain teacup on the dining table would be tipped over when I was certain it had been upright. The tiny bedspread in one of the upstairs rooms looked wrinkled, as though something had been lying on it. One night, while dusting the shelves nearby, I found something that froze me. Tucked against the back wall of the dollhouse was a tiny black and white photograph. It was no bigger than a postage stamp, the edges curled and yellowed with age. It showed a young girl, maybe 10 years old, with dark, glassy eyes. She wasn't smiling, she was staring straight ahead, straight at whoever was holding the photo, straight at me. The next morning, I started researching the estate where I had bought the dollhouse. The records led me to a disturbing detail. A girl had lived there in the early 1900s. She had died young. Some said from illness, others whispered something stranger. Neighbors claimed the family locked her bedroom after she passed and never touched it again. And that bedroom, according to the records, was where the dollhouse had always been. From then on, nights became unbearable. Around midnight, I would hear faint sounds in my living room, soft creaks, a high-pitched clink, like porcelain shifting against wood. Every time I got up to check, the dollhouse was sitting perfectly still, yet the air felt electric, like I had just missed catching something moving. That's when the activity became impossible to ignore. My cat, who usually lounged in the living room, refused to go near the dollhouse. She would hiss if I carried her too close, fur standing on end as if something invisible was threatening her. Sometimes she would sit in the hallway and stare at it from a distance, her eyes following the tiny windows like she was watching something move inside. I began to have dreams, always the same. I was standing in front of the dollhouse, peering through the windows, only this time there were shadows inside, figures moving from room to room. In one dream, a doll turned its head toward me and smiled, though in reality, its porcelain face was blank. I woke up drenched in sweat, and when I looked across the room, one of the dolls had been placed in the window, facing my bed. I tried to get rid of it. First, I left it at a donation center. The next morning, it was sitting on my porch. Then I drove it to a thrift store in another town and handed it over. 2 days later, I found it waiting on my doorstep again, as if it had followed me home. Now, it sits locked in the back of my closet, buried under blankets. I haven't opened that door in months. But sometimes when the house is quiet, I swear I hear them. Faint, deliberate footsteps, like something impossibly small is pacing across the wooden floorboards of my home. And I know deep down that it's waiting for me to open that door. Sometimes the worst things you'll ever find aren't hidden deep underground or locked away in a museum. They're sitting in plain sight, just waiting for the wrong person to stumble across them. For me, it was a brown suitcase I found walking home from school. I was 12 when it happened. My walk home cut through a back road called Miller Road, where people sometimes dumped old junk, busted TVs, broken bikes, scraps of wood. But one day, lying in the ditch just off the cracked asphalt was a brown leather suitcase. It was heavy-looking, scuffed, and stained dark in spots, like it had been sitting in the elements for years. Curiosity won. I dragged it home, my hands black with dust by the time I got to my driveway. The lock was broken, so I popped the clasps open. Inside wasn't clothes or papers, but a small wooden box wrapped in faded burlap. It was darker than the suitcase, with strange markings carved into the wood. It didn't look like any jewelry box or trinket holder I'd ever seen. And from the second I touched it, I felt something I couldn't explain. The air around me got heavier, and I swear I heard the faintest whisper, like someone breathing behind me, though I was completely alone. At first, I thought I had found something valuable. The wooden box had strange carvings burned into the surface, symbols I didn't recognize. Its lid was sealed shut with what looked like old wax, cracked in places but still holding. I tried to pry it open with a screwdriver, and the moment the seal snapped, a sharp odor filled the air, something like rotting flowers mixed with iron. Inside were objects that made no sense: a lock of hair tied with red string, a small, broken silver ring, what looked like dried herbs stuffed into a cloth pouch, and at the very bottom, a black and white photograph of a man with his eyes scratched out. That night, things started happening in the house. My bedroom door rattled on its hinges even though all the windows were shut. The lights flickered. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, only to find everyone in my family still asleep. The suitcase sat at the foot of my bed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. The longer the box stayed in the house, the worse things got. My little sister claimed she saw someone standing in the hallway at night, a man with no face. My mom complained about constant headaches when she was in the living room, right below where the suitcase was hidden in my closet. The worst night was a week later. I woke to a sharp knocking sound coming from inside the closet. 3 knocks. Then silence. When I opened the door, the suitcase had fallen forward, its lid wide open. The wooden box sat upright, as though someone had placed it carefully on the floor. The photo of the scratched-out man was now lying outside the box, directly in the middle of the closet floor. Terrified, I grabbed the suitcase, carried it back to Miller Road, and dumped it in the ditch where I had found it. I didn't sleep at all that night, waiting for the sound of footsteps to return, but they didn't. To this day, I've never walked Miller Road again, but sometimes, when the wind is quiet, I swear I can hear that same faint whisper, like something I left behind is still calling my name. Sometimes the most dangerous things aren't bought or found, they're passed down. The strangest thing I ever inherited was an antique mirror from a great-great-grandmother I never even met. When my grandmother passed away, she left behind a handful of keepsakes, most of them old photographs and letters, but buried in the back of her attic was a tall, ornate mirror wrapped in a moth-eaten sheet. She explained once, in passing, that it had belonged to her grandmother, who had emigrated from Ireland in the late 1800s. The mirror was beautiful, but unsettling. Its frame was carved from dark wood with curling vine patterns, and the glass had a faint silver haze to it that seemed to ripple if you stared too long. I never met the woman who owned it, but the second it was placed in my apartment, the atmosphere shifted. At night, the air in the room where it stood felt colder, heavier, as though the mirror was more than just glass. At first, it was subtle. Passing by, I'd catch glimpses of movement that weren't mine. A shadow flicking across the glass, a slight delay when my reflection turned its head. Once, while brushing my teeth, I saw my reflection smile faintly. though my own face hadn't moved at all. The most disturbing moment came late one night. I walked past the mirror and froze. Inside, my reflection was standing several feet closer than I actually was, pressed right up to the glass, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The longer I looked, the more wrong it became. Its breathing didn't match mine. Its chest rose when mine fell, and when I stepped back, it didn't move. I slammed a blanket over the mirror, but even covered, the feeling persisted. My apartment was alive with soft creaks and whispers, the kind that make you feel watched. The final straw happened a week later. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of glass tapping, soft, deliberate knocks coming from the covered mirror. When I pulled the blanket away, my reflection was already there, standing too close, its eyes black in the dim light. I grabbed the mirror and dragged it outside, shoving it against the far wall of the garage. The next morning, when I went to check, the glass was cracked down the center. Behind the crack, faint and hazy, was something I'll never forget. Shapes that didn't belong to me. Pale hands pressed against the other side of the glass, clawing like they were desperate to get out. I never brought the mirror back inside. It's still locked away in storage. But even now, I wonder if it's just waiting for another generation of my family to inherit it.